Good morning, everyone. My name is Lin Zhao. I'm from ExxonMobil, and thank you so much for joining our oil spill response knowledge transfer webinar. This is our webinar 19. This is also the third talk on the Oil in the Sea 4 series, and I'm really grateful that we have Dr. Victoria Broje to come to give a talk. Dr. Victoria Broje is a principal emergency management specialist in Shell. She supports all Shell business globally on environmental and scientific aspect of oil spill response. So Victoria will provide more background shortly. But before I give the floor to Victoria, I'm going to go through some bolts and nuts of the webinar. So as you know, the timing for our webinar is every first Tuesday of the month from 10 to 11:15 Houston time. And so our speakers will have an hour to talk, and then we will leave 15 minutes for questions. The attendees can only type their questions through Q&A button, and then we will go through the questions after the talk. And the last thing I want to mention is that we are going to record the whole webinar, both audio and the video. I already put a link in the meeting invite, so we are going to put the recordings in the API website. We'll keep updating the recordings in that website. That's all I need to go through. Now I give the floor to Dr. Broje.
Thank you very much, and it's really a privilege to be speaking to you today and present you Chapter 4, Accidental Spill Mitigation of Oil in the Sea for Inputs, Fate, and Effect book. And I have been involved in science of oil spill response for the last 20 years, and I've been privileged to work with and learn from some of the most knowledgeable experts in this field, and you have heard presentations by some of them in this webinar series, so I appreciate Exxon conducting this information sharing. My master's was from St. Petersburg State Technical University, and I specialized in modeling of oil spills in Arctic. And then I did my doctoral degree in University of California, and I specialized in optimizing mechanical recovery of oil spills and invented grooved surface for disc and drum skimmers. And for the last 15 years or so, I was working in Shell. I train environmental specialists that may be engaged in emergency response. I manage research and development projects on oil spill response and also support our businesses globally in contingency planning, responses and natural resource damage assessment to make sure that they have access to all the best technologies. And one exciting thing about this field is that for industry, this is a non-competitive area. So we all work together as companies and collaborate with government and academia and non-profits and consulting organizations to develop these response techniques and share this information freely and bring it to other countries, because we are all interested to have as good as a preparedness as we can have it and make sure that we respond to all spills as a community quickly and effectively. So I'm really proud to be a part of this community. Also, I sit on different trade association committees that are developing different guides and translating the research findings into practical recommendations for spill responders. I'm chairing Board of Directors for Clean Caribbean and Americas. This is a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing oil spill response information and best practices across Americas. And I am also very honored to be a chair of the 2024 International Oil Spill Conference. And I would like to invite all of you next May to New Orleans. It will be our first in-person meeting in the last 7 years. And that will be the place where all the greatest and latest emergency response information and oil spill science is shared. So I'm very much looking forward to that event. And this Oil in the Sea 4 is my third project with National Academies. So today I am not speaking on behalf of myself or Shell. Today I am speaking on behalf of National Academies and my esteemed co-authors for this publication. If you attended last two presentations, you would know that National Academies conducted these studies to look at inputs, fate, and effects of oil in the sea since 1975, and has 3 reports that it released already. And it has been 20 years since the last report. So obviously a lot of things happened in 20 years, and our work was cut out for the team to update these reports and cite all the advanced inventions and advancements in this field, as well as to make recommendations of what can be done going forward. So this is how Oil in the Sea 4 is in the context of other reports. And this has been a very interesting project because it started in fall of 2020, right during COVID time. I think it may be a first National Academy report produced completely virtually. We met as 17-member committee monthly, only virtual meetings. I haven't met most of my co-authors in person. And we were able to discuss and share information virtually. We have had invited talks from industry experts, from academia, from indigenous communities, from various consultants, and we were supported by 3 consulting teams. So we had 58 invited speakers. And once the report was drafted, it was additionally reviewed by 13 additional experts. So we wanted to make sure that we collect all the knowledge that exists in our field and our community and make it available to public. And of course, we would like to thank sponsors of the study that you can see on the screen. Without them, this publication would not be possible. And I just want to show you how it looks like. If my screen allows. So it's 500 pages publication. It's very comprehensive with quite a bit of nice illustrations. And what's important, that it's available for free online. If you go to National Academies, you can download it for free, and it covers many very good topics. And we make references to more than 1,000 peer-reviewed publications. So we summarized a lot of information for you in a very digestible format. So today I'll just highlight some of the key topics discussed in chapter 4. Here you can see our committee. We were chaired by Kirsi Tika and Ed Levine. And committee really was very, very interdisciplinary because, as you know, emergency response and oil spill response is a very complex topic. That's why we had experts in air science, in human health, modeling, chemistry, spill statistics, microbiology, toxicology, environmental resources, wildlife management, and so on. So it's been a really great privilege to work with these great scientists, and I learned a lot from them. And as a result, we are happy to present you our combined consensus conclusions. Report structure follows these questions. What is oil and where oil in the sea comes from? That's what you heard in previous series, chapters 2 and 3. Today, I will focus on chapter 4, spill response. And then subsequently, you will hear about chapter 4 and 5, where oil goes, fate, and impacts. And I want to highlight that this is the first report of this National Academy series that includes a standalone considerable response chapter. And also this report significantly expanded on human health impacts. So that's 2 very important topics that were added. So now if we look at what has happened in response and prevention, we need to acknowledge that the best response is the one you never have to have. So prevention is absolutely a key. For example, salvage operations are very important to oil in the sea concept because it prevents or reduces significant volumes of oil to entering into environment by therefore protecting it and reducing the need for spill response. So these technologies are very important. In pipeline, in spill prevention from pipeline, onshore and offshore, in the last 20 years, there has been considerable improvements. And altogether, they resulted in, let's say, last 5 years in US, there was a 36% reduction in number of spills causing environmental impact, despite the fact that pipeline production grew by 10% for miles and barrels delivered. So all these prevention techniques, they do help, and there's a statistics to show it. And when we talk about prevention measures, it's never about just one technique. It's always a complex system between people, technology, and equipment. And if we look at, let's say, equipment and pipelines, there are a variety of technology that are used these days to prevent spills. It's integrity monitoring, for example, using smart peaks, which are the sensors that go inside the pipeline, and they can monitor its integrity and give alerts if, let's say, walls got thinner or maybe there is a crack, so that pipeline can be replaced before spill occurs. And of course, if there is a leak that might happen, then there is a variety of leak detection techniques and technologies that can be installed inside and outside of pipeline that can give a quick alert to an operator, and a system can be shut off to prevent large volumes of oil entering the environment. And I won't list you all the different techniques that are used for this in offshore and onshore pipelines. I invite you to see some of the references provided in the book. And not only technologies itself got improved and communication and the data processing, but also we are really now looking into it as a system that includes risk management and safety assurance, investigation, and lessons learned sharing and staff competence and training. So all of this really is being looked at the system, and now there is a more and more formal way to ensure all these components are in place and that our prevention is robust. If we look in wells and source control, obviously after Deepwater Horizon, there has been considerable effort to improve well safety and ways to close the source from offshore installation should the release occur. So that resulted in great advances in blowout prevention and source control technologies. Organizations, for example, in the US, like Center for Offshore Safety was established to ensure this information gets disseminated to interested parties. And you see on the image here a picture of capping stock. These are new pieces of equipment that were invented and built around the globe to be able to install them on the top of well that may be experiencing loss of control, and shut the well in to make sure oil stop coming into the environment. So several of those consortia owning a variety of these capping stocks specifically tailored to different high pressure and high flow environment, high temperature environment. So this is a great improvement in capabilities that we didn't have before. And of course, especially after Deepwater Horizon, there has been a great number of new rules and regulations for offshore exploration and production in US and in Canada, as well as other countries. And I just list a few here because I cannot go into great details. But something that is important is that there is never only one barrier between oil and environment, because if this barrier fails, then oil will be free to be discharged. So there's always now a requirement for two independent barriers. It may be a drilling mud weighing the liquids down into the borehole, as well as there may be blowout preventer. And usually there are several of them to make sure that no failure of any one barrier results in a spill. There are very rigorous testing, inspection, and certification of well completion activities and well control equipment. There are exercises. One was just completed in Gulf of Mexico recently, when these capping stacks are taken out of the warehouse and deployed from the vessels in the sea to make sure that they are working and they can be used in a real world environment. There are also real-time monitoring centers that are used when some high-risk drilling activities are taking place. And even if somebody is drilling on Alaska, the same data that the command post in Alaska would see will be transmitted maybe to Houston and New Orleans and will be monitored by different sets of experts. And anybody involved, they have a stop work authority. So if anybody on the platform sees that something is not right, something that may result in an accident, they have authority to stop the work regardless the consequences. And of course, there is new reporting requirements. And again, just like with pipelines, there is a much greater focus now on human factors, because our equipment is getting better and better, but we are all humans and we make mistakes. So there is a lot of training and scientific advances going into making sure that people are well trained and they have procedures and conditions to work as effectively as they can. So now if we move from prevention to actual response, we can acknowledge that incident command system is really a gold standard for emergency management, and it allows to integrate between many different interested parties and use resources most effectively, make decisions most effectively, and really ensure that our response is as efficient as possible. And not only it's used in US and Canada, but it also is adopted by many countries in some modified format sometime, but this was really tested as a robust system. Also, we have benefited from great advances in computer science and digital information processing. So common operating picture is our way to gather information from different sources and display it in a command post and across virtual organization that may be monitoring and supporting spill response from different locations in the world. Now they all have convenient way to see the same information, see the resources, see which actions are being taken and contribute. And of course, with all the digital tools past COVID, now we see great improvements in this virtual responses when you don't all have to be in one room. You can do this work virtually. Also, we acknowledge that classification of coastal environments and environmental sensitivity indexes are very helpful for emergency responses. And again, they also go digital, and there is different projects to digitize them and make them available in different formats, not just as hard copy maps, but digitally. We also advanced our risk assessment tools of how we evaluate different scenarios and how we choose the response technique that would be most effective under specific conditions. And of course, again, back to advances in IT and computing technologies. In addition to remote sensing, I would say spill modeling and analytical methods, that's what's so greatest advances. Our models and numerical models getting smarter and smarter, and they're more integrated with atmospheric and oceanographic models. They run faster and with greater resolutions. And now we can transfer this information easier than ever before. And of course, remote sensing and monitoring in field is getting better, not just operationally, but also monitoring for environmental impacts. And I'll mention in the end of my presentation about improvements in wildlife management that we have seen over the years. And one of the key concepts in emergency response is, of course, a response toolbox. It's a recognition that we have a variety of response tools, and none of them is perfect under every situation. We have to see dispersants use in-situ burning, mechanical recovery, shoreline response, natural attenuation as really a toolbox that we have access to, and we can pick from depending on the need. And we acknowledge in the report that emergency response is kind of similar to medical profession. Just as doctors, we may be faced with a situation that we wish we didn't have, but there are professionals that spend their whole careers, 20, 40 years, studying specific aspects and components of emergency response, and they collectively bring their expertise to help make this situation less bad. So we would evaluate different treatment techniques, medically and oil spill response speaking. We would weigh their advantages and disadvantages and side effects, and collectively, using all of our tools, be able to pick one that is most effective under the situations to protect people and environment and result in the fastest ecosystem and societal recovery. So this is a very important concept that I think most people recognize right now. Something that also we acknowledge is that development of all of these tools require a lot of collaboration of different disciplines and consistent level of funding. Unfortunately, in emergency response, we see this boom and bust of funding when there is a lot of funding that came after Deepwater Horizon and great research programs like GOMRI were established and MPRI in Canada. But now 10 years later, we may see a decline, and then some of the researchers that got expertise in this topic, they may transition to another topics and another fields, and we would lose some of this expertise. Emergency response professionals may choose to go and work somewhere else. So it's very important to maintain consistent level of funding that throughout the years would help our community to develop better and better tools and make sure that we integrate all the advances in science and computation technology into our work. Another topic that is very important is field experiments. As you can even see on this illustration, emergency response at sea especially, it's not something that you can simulate in a laboratory beaker. The scales we work with, they're very large, and it's just simply not possible to recreate ocean waves in a laboratory beaker. And that's what challenges a lot of the data interpretation. That's what hampers a lot of advancements in the technology, and frankly creates quite a bit of unnecessary controversy between scientists arguing about extrapolation of their experiments to the field. If we could do field experiments with real oil, this could all be much easier. Unfortunately, in the US currently, we cannot conduct experiments with oil. And in some other countries like Canada and Norway, it's been very difficult to get those permits, and we are grateful when we get this opportunity. But this is something that our committee recognized that would really help to continue to advance oil spill response techniques. So if we look at different tools in our toolbox one by one and just discuss what advances have we seen in the last 10, 20 years and also what else need to be done. It's described in detail in the report, but this is something that I can highlight in my presentation. As far as oil on water observation, it's not just about monitoring where the oil slick is. Yes, there are overflights and sensors and missions that help us to delineate the slick and the coverage and maybe thickness in some situations. But we also use remote sensing and monitoring to verify, for example, satellite imagery and determine whether it was oil or an artifact. We can also do fingerprinting of different slicks to determine the source. Also, monitoring and remote sensing supports strategic and tactical oil spill response techniques. It can direct mechanical recovery vessels to thickest portions of the oil, so they can be 100 times more effective. And also they can help dispersants plane find patches of the slick where dispersants can be most effective. Also, remote sensing is used for monitoring of presence and absence of wildlife in the area, not just in contaminated area, but around it. We can also monitor socioeconomic resources, marinas and beach, to see how the use of those resources have changed over time. It can help with shoreline cleanup assessment techniques. The techniques themselves for shoreline been in existence for decades, but now there are advances in using a kind of electronic scat, and underwater scat was developed for sunken oil in nearshore area, and even canine scat, when now we can use dogs to detect different concentrations of oil in the beach. So there's a variety of the missions that remote sensing is used for. And if we think about the technologies, we have platforms that we can put sensors on, and them both have seen pretty considerable improvements. So of course we have satellites and helicopters and planes, and that we can put sensors on. But now with development of drone technologies, we can also use them for a rapid assessment of the situation. And also we've seen development in the sensors that we can put on those platforms, like infrared and ultraviolet and hyperspectral, and they get better and better, not just acquiring data, but analyzing and transmitting the data. And of course, just like with the response toolbox, in remote sensing toolbox, there is a variety of tools and sensors, and not any one of them is perfect for each situation. That's why the best remote sensing and monitoring program is the one that combines all platforms and all relevant sensors and integrates them together. And as the recent improvements, there are now commercial planes that integrate many of the sensors together, allow to process all this information at once and have this comprehensive view of the situation. And other types of improvement and development that we acknowledge was done for Arctic condition. In the last 20 years, there have been significant interest to Arctic exploration. And there has been several studies. I would mention Arctic Response Technology Joint Industry Project that generated a lot of knowledge and good summaries on this topic. That's why we didn't feel like we need to include extensive discussion about this into our report, but we reference them if you're interested in this information. So if we have oil in ice, we have several techniques also that we can be used. Surface ground penetrating radar has shown its effectiveness for oil under ice. Dogs have been tested in Arctic conditions, and they can detect oil kilometers away under snow. Also, ground penetrating radar have been tested from helicopter and showed some promise. And as well, there are some underwater techniques that can allow us to detect oil under ice. So again, a variety of different strategies. You just need to reach out to specialists in this topic so they can advise you which of these techniques would be most relevant in the specific conditions. So if we go into response techniques themselves, it cannot be stated enough that safety of public and responders is of paramount importance in emergency response. We would not do anything to hurt people. And mechanical recovery in the marine environment is a pretty dangerous situation. And of course, it's done by professionals using best response tools and vessels and all the appropriate PPE. But we do need to recognize that these are people working in offshore conditions that can be challenging. They are working in oil, exposed to environment and exposed to volatile hydrocarbons. So really, we should consider minimizing exposure to people as much as possible if the same can be achieved through other response technique. I think this topic was underemphasized in the past, but with this publication and significant section on human health impact, I think this topic that really need to be considered more carefully. So if it is not safe to deploy mechanical recovery at sea, oftentimes natural attenuation and biodegradation can be a very good response option. And for example, if it's a spill of light condensate or a small diesel spill offshore, it will biodegrade naturally, and it's a much better option than sending vessels to the site, burning hydrocarbons on the way there, creating air emissions, exposing people to risk, recovering this little bit of a product with potentially a lot of water, then transferring it back to the shore. and storing and disposing it. So mechanical recovery, just like any other response technique, should really be considered from cradle to grave, and environmental and socioeconomic analysis of it has to be considered as a whole. You cannot just say, well, my skimmer shows that I can recover X gallons per minute. It sounds good, I'm going to go for it. Because mechanical recovery really works as a system. As a person that spent 4 years of a PhD thesis developing skimmers, I can tell you it's not about skimmers, it's about a system. We are working against physics because oil spreads so thin and so fast in open ocean that it's very difficult to corral it back. And for us to recover it, we have to corral it. That's why we are using these booms, these floating fences, to bring oil in and feed it to our recovery devices. So our recovery devices are a lot more capable than the amount of oil they're realistically seeing in the field. So this needs to be considered as a system, and the focus has been in developing this equipment in improving encounter rates. How much oil can we bring into booms and recover to make it effective. And another improvement was in improving mechanical recovery in ice. When oil is collected between ice cakes, ice flows, you don't have to use boom. You can reach out into those pockets and pick up oil using skimmers, and special types of Arctic skimmers being developed, and as well as pumping and processing for cold oil or heavy oil. So there has been considerable advances, but we should not forget that the mechanical recovery of large spills offshore is always limited by the encounter rate of how much oil they're seeing. And also, mechanical recovery only works in relatively calm seas, let's say under 6 feet of wave height, because once it goes higher than that, not only booms start failing in collecting oil, but there's really no oil on the surface because it's being dispersed. So mechanical recovery has some limitations, and historically, anecdotal kind of saying was that for large offshore spills, mechanical recovery picks up less than 10% of the release, and some recent studies show that it's actually much less than 10%. So mechanical recovery alone cannot be completely relied on to remove large offshore oil spill. This is why we need to consider other techniques for the offshore. That said, mechanical recovery will always be considered, and it will be effective, especially closer to the shore, in the ports, in calm areas, and close to the large collection of response resources. So if we look at other response techniques, what we can consider over decades of research, in situ burning of oil in place have shown a great promise and really proven itself as a response technique. It has been used with great success during Deepwater Horizon. They conducted about 400 burns and burned a volume of oil that's larger than Exxon Valdez oil spills, and they did it safely for people and for environment. So this is a really good technique that can be used under some conditions in spill response. And there are several ways to use this technique. We can either burn oil when it's collected inside of a fireproof boom offshore, or it can be burned in marshes. If oil got into marsh, it can be a very effective and environmentally friendly way to remove oil. In situ burning is especially a useful tool in the Arctic, because oil weathers pretty quickly and emulsifies quickly in open water in temperate climate. But in Arctic, especially when it sits between ice, it remains fresh for a longer period of time, and considerably thicker because ice flows don't allow it to spread, which makes this opportunity for us to ignite it and burn it, and it potentially burnable for a much longer window than in temperate climates. So oil collected between ice or oil pushed against ice age, that can be a very good scenario for in situ burning, again, if environmental conditions are allowed, and we always monitor for potential environmental impacts. This technique requires regulatory approvals, It requires a robust monitoring for air emissions and also monitoring of impacts in the water column. So it always accompanies in-situ burning. Something that is very exciting and most recent development in this field is the use of herders. Herders are specially designed low toxicity chemicals that can be applied at very small quantities around the slick, and it allows slick to contract and reach higher thickness that's needed for in-situ burning. And then it can be ignited without the use of booms, and oil can be eliminated quickly that way. So most recent development is to integrate this herding and burning technology into these jet ski vehicles that can be deployed offshore and can move very quickly. And then without a need for people to be there because they are remotely operated, they can apply herder, and from the same vehicle, you can throw ignited gelled gasoline and ignite the slick. So they can maneuver between different slicks quickly and ignite it. So this is one of the latest and greatest technique that we have right now. Herder's been in existence since 70s, and they were studied quite a bit. And there has been renewed interest in herders related to Arctic exploration and cleanup of oil in ice. But now with this new jet ski technology, it has additional promise that may improve overall effectiveness of in-situ burning in Arctic and in temperate conditions. And this prototype of jet ski was just tested last month in Alaska in artificial lakes. And it herded and ignited slick, and really showed itself as a very useful tool. So we hope that we will be able to test it in a field condition at some point of time soon. Dispersants is a very controversial tool in spill response, and I would argue unjustly so. And we, in our report, decided not to go in all the details about dispersant science, because there were several recent publications that provide a very detailed overview of dispersant science. So I will refer you to a publication by the National Academy of Science called The Use of Dispersants in Marine Oil Spill Response, that was released in 2020. Also, the Canadian Science Advisory Secretariat report, State of the Knowledge of Chemical Dispersants for Canadian Marine Oil Spills by DFO, released in 2021. And also there was a Government Accountability Office in US report on dispersants, and several other publications that can cover dispersant science and impacts in much greater details. For this report, we focused on operational parameters and effectiveness of use, and then there would be more discussion about it in our effects section and some in-fates. So while not very comprehensively reviewed in this particular report, we do provide all the latest references for detailed information if you're interested. And here I just want to highlight that dispersion is a very natural process, and oil will be dispersing at sea, whether we use dispersants or not. And some of the light oil spills, especially in high seas, may completely disperse naturally. And of course, if you have a blowout, significant portion of that oil coming from the well will be dispersed naturally. And in case of a condensate, for example, spill, maybe the entire slick will be dispersed. So dispersants were really designed to work with nature, and there are low toxicity chemicals specifically designed to work at sea that we can apply from planes, helicopters, vessels, or inject into blowout. And they help oil to be broken into very tiny droplets that are diluted in marine environment and biodegraded by naturally present bacteria. And we really have a benefit of applying dispersants, especially from planes, compared to mechanical recovery or in-situ burning, because planes are much quicker to get to the site, and they can treat much greater area quicker than vessels for mechanical recovery or in-situ burning that may take hours to get to the site, and they are much slower to maneuver because of how carefully they have to advance with booms to collect oil in the apex. So the encounter rate of dispersant separations and spraying from the plane is much greater. And also dispersants can work in much higher Cs than mechanical recovery or in-situ burning. So in some situations, it may be the only response option. And latest and greatest is the use of subsea dispersants injection right into a well at the point of release subsea. It was used in Deepwater Horizon and showed good effectiveness. And this technique is particularly interesting for us because it allows us to control injection and dispersant application in one manageable point. So we can tailor the dose, while at surface we spray dispersant at 1:20 ratio. Subsea we can go as low as 1:100, potentially 1:200. So we can use less dispersants in one manageable point at the place where oil is freshest and most turbulent conditions that really promote effective droplet formation. If you think about surface spills and oil weathering, in a matter of few days, oil may become too emulsified and viscous for dispersants to work. So surface application only have few days maybe worth of operations before oil become not dispersible, and it can only work daylight hours. So if it's a blowout, then each night there is more oil released, and each day you have a bigger spill. Subsea dispersant injection can work 24/7 and any weather condition, and it allows oil to be diluted in the deeper environment when there is a lot of water for dilution. So if environmental conditions allow, dispersant can be a very valuable technique. Another improvement is dispersants used in ice condition. There has been studies and field demonstrations to invent special application equipment that allows spraying dispersants between ice flows. Instead of just spraying on top of ice, it can be maneuvered to spray between ice, and use of prop wash to disperse oil in a broken ice field that also showed promise. And of course, we are benefiting from all the monitoring and remote sensing technology. Dispersant operations are always accompanied by regulatory approvals and oversight. So we always, as a community, have to do a robust monitoring in the water column and from the air when dispersants are used. And now there are specific instructions from governments on how to do it. And industry as a co-op, they established ready-to-go sampling kits, for example, for subsea dispersants. Not only we have idea of how to do sampling, but we have standby scientists with very comprehensive packages suitable for deep sea deployment that can monitor water column, take water column samples and do this monitoring even in the deep water. So great advances in this regard. It has to be mentioned, though, that dispersants is not always the techniques that should be used. It should be considered, but there are situations when dispersant will be not a good technique. And we also highlight in the report that it shouldn't be used, for example, in estuarine environment when there is no dilution and no water movement or a lot of sediment. We don't want to disperse oil in this situation because we don't want oil to stick to sediment and precipitate to the bottom. We cannot disperse oil in a situation when there is no dilution or when there is limited biodegradation. So in the report, we talk about these limiting factors that can limit application of dispersants. And there is quite a bit of controversy in the literature, and you may hear it on the TV or newspapers about dispersants and why scientists can't agree whether it's a good technique or not. And what is interesting, it's actually not about dispersants and even not about oil or spill response. It's about our limited ability to represent ocean environment in the laboratory conditions. That's where the challenge comes from. For example, if you think about effectiveness and how would you test the effectiveness of, let's say, dispersants at sea? Well, oil undergoes weathering processes and it changes, and these conditions alone are very difficult to simulate in a laboratory condition. But also dispersion itself, let's say on surface, is driven by surface oceanographic waves. And that's something that's impossible to simulate in a laboratory in a beaker. So To meet this to address this need, scientists are coming up with the proxy setups that may simulate one portion of certain big scale process that allows them to study this process. For example, for effectiveness, scientists may put oil in a beaker and spin it carefully or shake it and use that to see how different dispersants work. And it allows them to compare one oil to another oil or one dispersant to another dispersant, but it has very limited relevance of how this dispersion would actually happen in the real event in field conditions. So it has to be recognized that if you look at effectiveness tests, you should ask not which dispersant they used, but which tests they used, because it can vary 50% or 100% in effectiveness, depending which test you use and how hard you shook that bottle. Same thing with biodegradation. If you wanted to study biodegradation of dispersed oil, these are processes that happens on parts per billion, parts per trillion scale in the ocean over days, weeks, or months. And we just don't have this capability in chemistry and analytics to study these processes at the scales. So scientists have to pack up a lot more oil in the beaker and try to study it there. By doing so, they create conditions that are not representative of the field. And again, it allows us to compare different maybe fertilizers to each other, or compare different oils, but not really directly predict what will happen at sea, because in this situation, oxygen may be limiting, nutrients may be limiting, something that would not happen at sea. And here in the diagrams, I'm showing illustration of the same point for toxicity studies, which are especially controversial for dispersants. If you look at these experiments in laboratory conditions, and I'm showing here large fish, but of course, in the laboratory condition, we are testing larvae and fish eggs because we want the most sensitive organisms to be tested. So when oil is just sitting on top of the aquarium, it may not affect fish or larvae, but when you disperse it, it's now more bioavailable in this beaker, and it doesn't change oil chemistry or toxicity, it just makes it more bioavailable as dispersant intended. But in the sea, it will be very quickly diluted, while in a laboratory, this beaker may sit there with this constant high concentration for 96 hours and monitor how many organisms would die. And it's done on purpose because this test creates this steady state condition that allows scientists to compare oil to oil, dispersants to dispersants, further to further, chemical to chemical. But again, this cannot be extrapolated to impacts in the real world, because if you look at the real world, not only oil naturally dilutes in a matter of hours, but also organisms are afraid to move. So now we have models that allow us to take these results from laboratory tests and then model what would happen in environment. And that's a very important step that people may forget. So when scientists are saying, well, how can my research be more relevant? How can you use it in decision making? Committee acknowledges that the experiments need to be clearly described of what you're trying to simulate. If you can explain to the reader how you designed experiments and how it relates or doesn't relate to real life environment, it would make it much easier for us to integrate between studies, make sense of them, and integrate it into the big picture. Unfortunately, when there is no consistent approach of how this big ocean is simulated in a laboratory, individual studies use methods that are not compatible, and as a result, there is perceived conflict of information, and it doesn't allow all of us to integrate all the studies together and for decision makers to make an informed decision based on available science. And this is why work like by Canadian government or National Academies that reviews these thousands of studies and try to make sense of them are very important, because in this case, it's really all about context, and it's something that should not be forgotten. So committee wants to emphasize the importance of consistent protocols and analyzing properly chemistry and other factors and reporting the results in the way it can be easier to integrate into analysis and decision making. So every effort is being made to clean up oil offshore, because once oil comes to nearshore environment, it becomes a totally different story. Offshore, we have a lesser organism density and more opportunity for oil to dilute. Once you come near shore, that's where we often see a concentration of the younger forms of organisms and higher organisms density. And also that's where people are present, and that's where greatest impact on wildlife and humans, physical and psychological impact, may be observed. So while every effort is made to clean up oil offshore, sometimes it doesn't succeed. And then we need to discuss what we are going to do if oil comes closer to the shore. And we try to deploy protective booming, but as practice shows, it cannot cover very large area. You cannot string a boom parallel to the shore through the entire Gulf Coast and call it protected. This is actually not how it works. You have to be very strategic and deploy protective booming in specific areas that you want to protect, but it will not be very large areas. And if oil gets to the shoreline, there is a variety of cleanup techniques can be used, but it's important to acknowledge that they sometimes can do more harm than good. That's why sometimes in a marsh environment, letting oil to biodegrade naturally, or maybe doing in situ burning, may be a better technique than bringing in heavy machinery and tramping all over the marsh. So in the report, we highlight some of these more advanced technique like burning and use of surface washing agents and bioremediation agents. And I know there's always a fascination with bacteria, and people are asking, should we add bacteria to the sea to help clean up oil? And I think a general consensus that you don't need to add bacteria to marine environment. There are natural bacteria present that can biodegrade oil. And on shoreline environment, it's rarely needed, but it could be enhanced by adding fertilizers or tilting soil or doing surface washing to provide naturally existing bacteria with oxygen and nutrients that they need to do the work. And something that's very important for shoreline cleanup is that it's the longest lasting cleanup operations, usually in spill response, because it involves a lot of people, it takes a lot of effort, it exposes a lot more people, potentially public, to oil, and it creates a lot of waste. So waste management and logistics is a very important consideration when we are choosing shoreline cleanup techniques. So you will hear some of these discussions, we'll read some of the discussions in the book. So as I mentioned, there is a variety of response techniques, and they're not perfect. They all have advantages and disadvantages. And I mentioned that there are professionals that have experience with these techniques, and they can advise, depending on the situation, which one would be better to use. But also we have a formal methods to allow us to do this analysis and ranking and document it, so public can be assured that we did factor in all the potential drawbacks, potential impacts from dispersants and dispersed oil in the water column, potential impacts of in situ burning, so that we did factor it in. And if we decided to use certain response technique, they would know that we considered everything and still, as a community, decided that this response technique is the most effective under situation. It protects environment and people better, and it will facilitate faster ecosystem recovery. So over the years, we use the term net environmental benefit analysis, and it's a concept of do no harm. Don't do anything that would make it worse for the environment. And it can be implemented in a variety of ways. So in US, EPA and NOAA and Coast Guard have used this risk assessment matrix and a method of consensus ecological risk assessment for years to do this analysis. And lately, recently in 2017, IPCA, IOGP, and API proposed a new method. It's more computational numerical calculation called spill impact mitigation assessment, That's another method that can be used for formal assessment. And also industry conducted, I think, 2 or 3 by now, comparative risk assessments. This is a method that's more based on numerical simulations. So there is a variety of methods that we can employ, and they advanced in their kind of technology and practical applications in the last 10 to 20 years, but they all are based on the same principle. So the assumption is that oil is already in the environment and that we need to do something to mitigate the situation, that we want to consider all feasible response options. We don't want to exclude anything. We need to recognize that all response options, burning, dispersants, mechanical recovery, doing nothing, they have their limits, and they all need to be considered, and as well as their realistic effectiveness need to be considered. So we factor all of this in. We look at resources at risks, ecological resources, socioeconomic resources, spiritual, cultural resources, and one of the key components of all these studies is to bring stakeholders in and resource trustees, and as a community look at all of the resources and decide which response tools will be a better protection. And it's key that we are not focusing on one individual organisms. We are not trying to save the larvae at the expense of birds, for example. We are truly focusing on most sensitive organisms, on the slower to recover populations, and most importantly on the habitats. Because if habitat is healthy and some populations got affected, they will recover. If habitat is destroyed, then that larvae may not be able to live long because it has nowhere to go to. So there are these robust tools that now are used in the community, not just in US and Canada, but globally, that allow us to demonstrate to our stakeholders our due diligence and the depth of the analysis that went into selection of these response techniques. And I want to cover one last response technique. It's wildlife management. Let's say 20, 30 years ago, wildlife management was done by few nonprofit organizations, kind of on ad hoc basis by few enthusiasts. But recently it became absolutely critical and integrated technique in emergency response. And now it's integrated into preparedness, and it's not just response. So one of the greatest projects that was done lately in the last 10 years since Deepwater Horizon, it's a global oiled wildlife response system project. It's GOWRS, when 11 leading wildlife management organizations from 7 countries got together, and they developed this international framework for supporting each other and for wildlife response. They developed recommendation and best practices documents for animal care and guidelines. They developed standards and instructions for how to do wildlife response. So this is available online, and if you're interested, you can review. This was a great improvement in approach to wildlife management that consists of many different components. It includes keeping oil away from the wildlife. It includes keeping wildlife away from oil as primary and the secondary response technique. And then as a tertiary response technique, that's what you're seeing on the screen. It's actually what people think about wildlife response. It's a search, collection, cleanup, and rehabilitation of organisms that involves a lot of people and effort. And there's often a question, well, is it worth it? Is cleaning birds really worth it? And while there was some mixed reviews in earlier literature, I think more recent conclusion that it is, if it's done right, and wildlife is truly integrated in the preparedness. And yes, if it's done right, it will result in positive impact on the wildlife situation in the area. I also want to acknowledge that after Deepwater Horizon, NOAA, National Marine Fisheries, they established national procedures for citations, pinnipeds, and sea turtles. So that was also very useful information that is available online. And after Deepwater Horizon, we certainly have a better understanding of impacts of dispersants and dispersed oil and oil on different organisms. So as conclusions from the response chapter in Oil and Sea Core, I emphasize that source control and prevention is a priority, as well as protection of responders and public. Incident command system has been very instrumental in making response effectiveness. I introduce you to the response toolbox concepts and all the different tools that we have available. We talked about criticality of continuous funding for oil spill research throughout the years and importance of field experiments. So we don't struggle this much with this extrapolation of research results from the lab into the field conditions. And we are benefiting and will continue to benefit from advances in remote sensing, monitoring, modeling, and data management and other computer-related technologies. Something that you will also see throughout the book is we acknowledge that in addition to crude oil, now we see new products and specifically new fuel oil types, or like low sulfur fuel oil, for example, that has a different composition from crude oil or from conventional products. And oftentimes we are not sure what the composition is because it's mixed at very different rates in different places. So this is something that we recommend continuing to study as far as fate and response options and effects. And you will hear a presentation about health and safety risks, physical and psychological impacts to humans. This is a very significant portion of the report. And looking into the future, this, if you go to the report, you will see for each chapter, there are specific recommendations. So if you're in science or research or academia, you will be able to benefit from this discussion. And we again recommend field experimentations to improve our spill response tools and gather relevant information, understanding new fuel types, a life cycle analysis of oil spills based on different scenarios. It's very difficult to make a decision when you don't have information about outcomes of all response tools. If we do mechanical recovery, what would happen? If we do dispersants, what will happen? When researchers are focusing only on small components of each of these response scenarios, it's not possible to integrate them together. So integration would be something that will help us with decision making. Continuing to study health and psychological risks to response professionals and to public. Of course, continuous improvement in response tools and continuous investment into world wildlife management. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and take any questions that you may have.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Broje. Oh my God, that's a really great presentation. Like, give a very clear information about the response tools, etc. And yeah, I'm really grateful for this. And before we go through the questions, so I like to, before everybody leave, I want to say that our next webinar will be also one of the Oil in the Sea 4 series. So it will focus on the chemistry and the fate. So the presenters are John Farrington and Scott Sokolowski and Baron Tensel. So stay tuned. And now, so it seems we already have some questions coming in. So I will go through those questions first. Yeah. Excellent presentation. Coverage of response options was comprehensive with very good graphics. Could you comment on the comparative cost of the primary response options?
Comparative cost of response options like mechanical burning and dispersants. That would be tough to give a cost comparison. Also because it actually is never factored in the response. Whatever cost, it's cost. So this one factor that's definitely not a part of our net environmental benefit analysis. If there is a spill, all resources will be thrown into it, and we as a community emphasize prudent over response. So we will mobilize all the response techniques that are available Yes, I don't have an answer on that, but I want to emphasize that costs are not considered during spill response. We will bring everything that's needed.
Yeah, and I think a team has worked with Dr. Dagmar Atkin before.
Yes.
That you know, there are some publications on the cost of the response options. Yeah,
That's a good point. Yes, Dagmar has some of the publication on this topic.
yeah. Excellent presentation of the content of the chapter. Could you expand a bit more on the improvements in monitoring techniques and the feedback loop, and how it factors into decision making, and how clean is clean conundrum?
Yes, that's maybe a topic for its own seminar, and it's obviously comprehensive kind of issue. We are doing monitoring in the field, and we need to understand that sometimes it's immediate knowledge, and sometimes we are taking samples and they become results only a few weeks. So this is something that response professional knows, and we call it kind of operational and scientific monitoring. So if it's operational monitoring and you're doing something to get immediate feedback to the responders, it may be, for example, monitoring of dispersant effectiveness. So you apply dispersants and you do monitoring and you immediately see whether it's working or not. And then you can give comments to responders to continue to use this technique or not. On the other hand, sometimes when you do monitoring of parameters or taken samples of water quality, you will find out what's the concentration of hydrocarbons in that location at some point of time, but it won't be in the next week maybe. And how clean is clean, that's another interesting topic, especially relevant for the shoreline cleanup. And we continuously monitoring how, for example, cleanup is going and whether we see improvements, and if not, maybe we decide to use different tactics or maybe surface washing agents, for example, and then we would determine as a community and environmental unit what would be our target, how clean is clean, and also how would we monitor and confirm that this target has been met. So this is a really different answers, probably whether we are talking about monitoring of a shoreline cleanup on a shoreline, real-time operational monitoring of offshore dispersant operations, for example, or it's a sampling and monitoring more related to natural resource damage assessments. And we as a community have instructions for all of them, and the API and IPIC and industry guides on this topic. If you shoot me an email, I can send you more detailed information.
Great. So there are a lot of thank you and excellent presentation. And there is one question comment. When we think of a biodegradation after dispersion, is it not depend on the oil type and the specific compounds within the dispersed oil? For example, higher molecular weight aromatic chemicals co-mort to lower molecular weight aromatics?
Yes, excellent question. And we have absolutely excellent section in this report on biodegradation. That's something that's in great advances, and maybe next presentation you will hear something about that, because microbial genomics and our understanding of biodegradation of oil really improved in the last 10 years. So there is a lot of information that we provide in the report about it. I am not an expert in that particular field, but yes, of course, biodegradation of oil happens based on individual components. So smaller molecules, straight chains are easier for bacteria to degrade. So they degrade them first, and likely some of them are also more toxic. So bacteria help us to eliminate them from the environment. And if oil is composed of a large amount of heavy fractions like resins and asphaltenes, of course, by the time bacteria get to degrade those, this process will go much slower. And by the way, it's not one bacteria that degrades everything. Bacterial communities and environment, they change whether they need to degrade alkanes or some other aromatics or heavier molecules. So likely biodegradation goes better on the smaller and more toxic and more mobile fractions. And once the oil is degraded to asphaltenes, it's really not as toxic anymore because these components are not soluble. And even if they are present in the environment, they are not as dangerous as fresh oil, for example. And you can think about asphalt on our roads. We know asphaltenic molecules don't biodegrade well because we still have asphalt on our roads and we can use them. That's the evidence that molecules in heavy oils don't completely disappear by biodegradation, but also if these molecules are left, oftentimes they have much lower toxicity than the initial product.
Yeah, also a lot of continuous, a lot of congratulations on the great talk. And one question is, can you comment a bit more on R&D needs from responders' perspective for marine spills of new fuels, for example, biofuels?
Yes, so there has been several projects, and one project that just ended end of last year, I believe. It's called IMAROS, and it was conducted by CEDRA in France with collaboration with several other parties. I would invite you to explore that report, and they talk about these new fuels, and the research is needed in all topics of this whole life cycle of the spill, and we highlight it in our report because first we are struggling with even basic composition and chemistry of these fuels because they're blend to specification for low sulfur and they need to meet some pour point and viscosity criteria. But you can see in some of these recent reports that their appearance can be completely different. It can be very clear or very dark, and we often don't even know what's in there till we do chemistry. So once this product spilled, that's the first what we need to figure out. What's the composition? If we know the composition, then we can use all available knowledge to forecast how it will behave, but sometimes even composition is unknown. So that is one key need for understanding. Then another research that's needed in this regard is to understand how this chemical blends, or maybe even new products that will be coming on market, behave in the environment. How thin they spread, are they clear, can we see them with remote sensing techniques, are they dispersing naturally, how they behave in a different environment in Arctic versus temperate water. So that's something that needs to be studied. And then of course their impacts, their toxicity, because difference in chemical formulation can be quite different from one another. So it's not even a blanket statement or conclusion what impacts would be. Again, depending on the chemistry, we will need to figure out what would be impacts in different environments, what will be their biodegradations and persistence. And relevant for this chapter is how are we going to respond to them? Because if they spread easily and form such thin sheen that we cannot recover them, maybe we have to rely on natural biodegradation. If they behave like crude oil, maybe we can use conventional tools, but some concerns were that some of these new fuels have higher pour point, which means they become these waxy semi-solid substances when spilled at sea, meaning our conventional skimmers and pumps will not be as effective. So we will need to use different techniques on this. Luckily, we do have in our oil spill response organizations techniques and experience to deal with even waxy and semi-solid products, but we need to make sure to mobilize the right product to the site, because this oil may be changing very quickly, and what you're starting with, it's not something that you will end up responding 3 days from now. So there is a variety of topics that can be studied for new fuel oils.
Great. Yeah, great information. And following that question, so yeah, there are still gaps between academia research and actual oil spill response technology advancement, right? I just wondering, are there any opportunities for academia to be engaged in the response?
Yes, there is absolutely opportunity for academia to study different aspects of oil spill response. I would very much encourage them to reach out to practitioners like myself and specialists from government or other oil companies or response organizations, and we will be very glad to work with you to provide you this information about practical challenges and aspects of oil spill response and what we are seeing in the field, and help you design laboratory studies that would be more representative of field conditions. So the data that you will generate, then we will be able to kind of take into consideration and best practices. So I think there's a great opportunity for collaboration. And also for spill response, academia may want to know that there is opportunity to participate and contribute through environmental unit or scientific support coordinator. But because incident command system is such a structured system, it's a military-like organization, because we have to respond to spill quickly and efficiently. We cannot just let people not trained in the system come into hot zone without special training. So if you're interested, you can receive ICS training, you can get engaged in the regional response team meetings and area committees, and let professionals in your area know that you would be interested and what capabilities you have. And then if you provide this kind of resources and expertise, we do oftentimes reach out as environmental unit or scientific support coordinator professionals to academia to seek your advice on resources at risks or new technologies. And even sometimes there is opportunity to set aside maybe a small section of a shoreline to do experiments and testing. But again, the first priority is people, health and safety, protecting the environment, response. But if there is an opportunity and all the parties are prepared to act on it, there may be also opportunity for some research, but it has to be very well planned for. So I would encourage academia to reach out to us in advance.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And so for future research program, for example, to improve spill response technologies, any recommendations for future development?
Specifically for sampling?
Just like in general for spill technologies, if there are future research program, do you have any recommendations of what would be the focus? So yeah.
Yeah, I would invite people to look through the report, because we specifically at the end of the chapter list multiple topics that they can focus on. We explain how it's relevant. So rather than taking another hour of giving my recommendation, I invite you to read the end of each chapter in the report, where we consistently summarized exactly that.
Okay, okay, great. Let me check if there are more questions. Yep, I think that's all the questions we have right now, and I don't want to take more of your time. It's 11:20 already, and really appreciate your talk today, and yeah, really great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here for me and on behalf of my esteemed co-authors in National Academy of Science.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for attending as well. Bye-bye.